welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today with us, we have a very special guest, Asra Nomani, former Wall Street journalist, Wall Street Journal reporter who has just written a new book, and I'll show it to you right now. It's called The Woke Army. You can see it here, the Red-Green Alliance that is destroying America's freedom. She is also a senior fellow at Independent Women's Forum. And we are going to be discussing not only the book itself, but how it came to be, the processes behind the lawsuit that sparked the incredible revelations of a major character assassination campaign that should be front page scandal everywhere. Asra, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the Washington Outsider Report.
Oh, thank you so much, Irina. You know, I've been such a fan of your work and your own courage in standing up to those who are trying to distort the truth. And so thank you for giving me this chance to talk to you and all your great listeners.
Thank you for your courage, because it must have been quite a journey to get where we are, judging from the subject of the book. Before we get into all of that, could you tell our very diverse international and national audience a bit about your own journey, your work at the Wall Street Journal, and how you came to be doing what you're doing today?
Absolutely. I'm so honored to share this story, because it's really, like in so many people's lives, the power of the ancestry that I have inherited that brings me here before you today. I was born in the summer of 1965, first post-colonial generation after the freeing of India from British rule. So my parents, Sajda and Zafar Nomani, they were born into the British Raj, as it was called, and they remember so precisely, Independence Day, 1947, when my mother got a Cadbury chocolate at her Catholic girls' school in this hill station called Panchgani, India, outside of Bombay. And then my father, he remembers the Union Jack flag coming down from the flagpole in a courtyard and the flag of India ascending. It was what is now called white supremacy that my parents lived under. When I was born, they made a choice about where they would start the next chapter of our family story. And my father had done a trip to the United States of America. And it was here in the United States that he felt so inspired by ideas that are so embedded, in our hearts, of equality and justice, the dignity of labor. And so they chose for our family America. And to America I arrived. I was just 4 years old, knew not a word of English. And it was in the United States of America, in public school in the state of West Virginia, which is considered in its own way a third world country within the United States, less opportunities, less economic progress. But it was there in West Virginia, a mostly white state, where I just felt affirmed. And this lovely English teacher named Mrs. Alke gave me a journal. And it was in there that I wrote my thoughts as a 12-year-old girl and became a writer, Irina. And I was right about then that a family relative of ours had a daughter. And I think about her all the time whenever I think of you, because her name is Irina. And it's a different version of your name. But in that family, I watched a very puritanical interpretation of Islam take hold, because at that point in the 1970s and 80s, the government of Saudi Arabia was exporting to the world a very puritanical interpretation of Islam, while the Shia revolution in Iran was doing the same among its people. And so that's what I grew up in. And it was in America, that I was able to literally find my stride. I became a runner at Morgantown High School, and my parents were just amazing, amazing Muslims who raised me with a sense of equality. A cousin of mine came one day and told me that I was haram or illegal for wearing shorts. And my parents didn't care. They let me run. They gave me so much encouragement. And that's what then led to me becoming a reporter for the Wall Street Journal at the age of 23. It's just a remarkable story about the opportunity that we got in the United States of America. And it was in that context that I then had this confrontation with the most radical expression of Islam in our world today. And that's what made me then a Muslim reformer, and brings me, to writing this book and standing up, just like you, Irina, for truth-telling, and for dismantling those that are propagandists. And so I'm so excited to talk to you about the rest of this journey.
And how did you come to Wall Street Journal, and what did you cover while you were there?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So I had never read the Wall Street Journal as a young 23-year-old. I had grown up reading magazines and newspapers like the Christian Science Monitor, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. But, my family was an entrepreneurial family. My mom had a boutique on High Street. But, it's like a lot of things where big economic concepts and the big economy doesn't trickle down always to the regular people. And so I was looking for a job. I was in graduate school at American University, and that is where I studied issues that we're going to talk about today, about propaganda, character assassination, and communication campaigns. But there I was, just wishing to be a journalist. And I'd worked at Reuters. I'd worked internships every summer that I possibly could. So I'd worked at Newsweek on campus, a magazine for college students, and then Reuters while I was in graduate school. Had so many clips. And I went to a job fair. And at that job fair, I met the internship coordinator at the Wall Street Journal, and he liked my clips and offered me an internship in the San Francisco bureau. It wasn't a job, but at that point I didn't have a job. So I went for it, and I worked the hardest I'd ever worked over those 3 months, got several front page stories into the Wall Street Journal's pages. Irina, you'd laugh at some of them. It was the summer of 1988, and I was one of the first people ever to document the emergence of computer viruses. Can you believe that? They had just been born. A couple brothers in Pakistan had, created this virus phenomena. And now companies like McAfee were creating the defenses. So I did a big story about the big business of creating defenses for viruses. I wrote about Indian families and kids engaging in arranged marriages in the United States. And it was just really a really great moment in my own career. And from that internship, I got a job offer at the Wall Street Journal Chicago bureau. And there, the cub reporter job was to cover the commodities market. So I learned about pork belly futures, and it was, a really crash course in fundamentals of industry and economics. From there, I went to covering the airline industry, covered airplane crashes, and then moved to the Washington, D.C. bureau, where I covered international trade, regulatory issues. And I mention all of this because it so informs the work and the reporting that I've done for this new book, Woke Army, because it was there that I worked in the newsroom with great investigative reporters who taught me how to follow the money, and that was where the great stories were crafted of not just political contributions, but also lobbying groups and interest groups. And that's when I really learned that no matter what you are trying to understand, put an ink at the end of it and approach it like you do approach covering corporate America, like I did. So that fast forward many years later, just as to illustrate that point, when I came to covering issues within my faith of Islam, I started looking at it as Islam Incorporated, the propaganda, the marketing campaigns. That's what I was covering at the Wall Street Journal. And I saw, firsthand the thing that we now know of as strategic communications. How do you persuade people to buy your product? And that includes buying your ideology. And so all of that work that I did for 15 years at the Journal has informed my work today. To this day, I do not use an Oxford comma, a comma before the and in a series, because it was a, style issue that I learned back then. I love to finish every sentence with both a powerful punch that I learned from a great reporter named Rochelle Sharp, or now in the really difficult work that we do, I always try to flip any kind of sentence that I've got so that I end with a word of hope and optimism and solution. And so these are the small tricks that I learned, but also the practices, the practices of professional journalism, record keeping, documentation, collaboration, corroboration, and so much more that is all throughout this book. I'm so proud of it because it took me about 3 years past deadline to write, and took me 20 years of living, 10 years of reporting and writing to do. And it was in that course of that 10 years that I met you, Irina, and I'm just so happy that I can bring you the product of that work during that time. But thank you for asking, because I don't speak about that part of my career as much in detail, but it was everything that I learned during those 15 years as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal that informs my work today.
So your background as a journalist is very much in financial, economic issues, even though the skills are applicable to any investigative work and certainly the subject we're to cover here. But how did you go from covering very economic and business-like issues familiar to many Americans to a very niche subject that is also being quite suppressed by the entities that will be discussing? How did you transition into that part of your work?
Yeah, I was never planning it. I went into journalism just like a lot of people to make the world a better place. I mean, it was a really simple idea that I had inherited from my parents. My father had come to this country with a simple mission, and that was to serve humanity. And it is truly what I went into journalism to do. I had been given this gift and learned this craft of writing, and I loved talking to people. I had insatiable curiosity. And so that's what brought me to journalism. And my work was actually also very controversial in the Wall Street Journal frame, because we would wait for this one very proper editor to go on vacation to sometimes publish my stories, because I would write about things like the big business of selling new thong underwear in the lingerie market in the United States, and the fact that the airline industry had a new crisis with people trying to join the Mile High Club, which is, intimate relations at 30,000 feet. And I love to push the envelope. And so I'm just saying those couple of examples because people sometimes want to say my new incarnation became as a provocateur. And I think that's in fact what we're supposed to do as journalists, ask provocative questions. And that's what I was doing at the Journal. But my entry into this world that we're going to talk about today, and challenging that extremism within my community, was very personal. I had gone on book leave from the Wall Street Journal in the winter of 2000. I got a book contract to go to India to report on another industry and that I had gotten onto the front pages of the Wall Street Journal. And that was the big business of selling tantric sex in the world. So way different topic than what I end up doing over the next couple decades. But that put me right in South Asia, my home country. And I was going to the monasteries and the temples, looking at this philosophy that's called Tantra in India. It's been translated and simplified to the United States and the West as tantric sex, but it's much deeper. I organized my books chronologically behind me, and up at the top corner is Tantra and Hinduism and Buddhism, and then you end up with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so it was really like that my journey, took this turn. I was exploring Hinduism and Buddhism, the idea of the divine feminine, a lot of philosophical ideas. And then the tragedy of 9/11 happened, Irina, the tragedy that, shook the lives of all people who were alive that day. And then, of course, for generations to come. I was living at that time back in my hometown of Morgantown, West Virginia, on break from my trips to India. And I heard the news from my mom, watched the towers fall like the world did. And I was driven, like many journalists, to defy the State Department warnings and get on a plane to Pakistan. Half of my family from India had migrated to Pakistan, being Muslim. And so I had family from Karachi to Peshawar, up in the northwest frontier by the Afghan border. I knew that the ideology and philosophy of the hijackers was rooted in that same ideology and extremism that had told me as a little girl that I was, quote, illegal for wearing shorts. It had just taken this violent, brutal turn. And I went to Pakistan to be a reporter. And it was there then, Irina, that my entire career took a turn. And I ended up, turning all of my skills to exploring this industry of extremism that we have today.
So 9/11 was quite a turning point for many, but it also had a particular impact on Wall Street Journal itself. We all know about Danny Pearl's story and what happened. Were you still at the journal at the time? Did you know about that, and how did that impact his investigation, impact the way you were looking at these events, because they seem to be inextricably linked?
Oh, yes. So my dear friend Danny Pearl was a trusted friend of mine. He was a journalist along with me in the Washington, D.C. bureau. And when a lot of the other reporters had to rush back home to relieve their babysitters and au pairs for taking care of their children, Danny and I would hang out together, and he would teach me about American culture as I had never known it before. Being a good Muslim girl, I had never actually had a beer. And Danny said, we've got to change that. So at this bar called the Big Hunt, I had my first beer and I loved it. And my corruption began. I went to open mic nights at bars and music halls in this place called Adams Morgan. And Danny and I played beach volleyball behind the Lincoln Memorial. He was just the best of friends. He was somebody who was a good, that friend in the workplace that you're always just so happy to see, and you have lunches together. We used to go to a place called What's Cooking, and just get along great with the ladies behind the counter. It was just so wonderful. And so dear Danny also got, on a plane to Pakistan. He was working in India at the time. And I was on leave from the Wall Street Journal working on my book. And so what happened for me is that I ended up in Karachi, Pakistan. Danny was using Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, as his hub. And I rented an apartment. I rented a home. I rented a home in which I thought I was going to write the next great American novel in Karachi. I had fallen in love with somebody in Pakistan. I had taken seriously the little patch of my school years as a little girl, make love, not war. And I just was really immersing in a culture that was very familiar to me, but also very different, because having been born in America, having been born in India, but raised in America, I, knew a freedom that a lot of my female cousins didn't know in Pakistan. And so I rented my home. I had a really hard time getting the home because the realtors didn't rent homes to single women. And I ended up just really excited about, just being myself in the country. And then my friend Danny was coming to visit me, and he had with him his wife, Marianne, so excited because they had just found out that Marianne was pregnant, and Danny was so excited to have a baby. So they arrived, and he loved music, and so I went out. I got a bunch of bootleg CDs. I got. Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know who keeps calling. Let me check. Okay. I got beer. There's this brewery called Murray. So the slogan is have a Murray with your curry. And I called a bootlegger and got a supply. And then Danny came with Marianne. I settled them in. And the next day, January 23rd, 2002, Danny had an appointment for an interview. And all he told me was that it was with a cleric. I didn't know anything else. And, to this day, I wish I'd asked him more questions. I wish I had gone into his emails and seen the arrangements that he had made for this interview. But I only got to just see him off. He hustled into this cab that I had called, and Danny was always funny. He was always like we didn't have these kind of phones back then. We only had flip phones, and he had his phone, and he had his glasses on, and his wired ear earbuds. We didn't have wireless. Just think, it was 2002. We didn't have Twitter. We didn't have, hardly used Google at that time. And Danny hustled into the cab, and that was the last that I ever saw of him. I waved goodbye to him and said, "See you later, buddy." But I was not to see him again, because that night then he was kidnapped. He was kidnapped by men who had used Danny's inquiries for this interview with a cleric as a trap. They had used that interview as the bait, and there was no interview. He was put into a car, and that car drove him to this far away compound outside of the city. And there they put a gun to his head, these captors, and hustled him into this room in which he was then shackled. And poor Danny, he was so innocent and so pure. He thought, even at that time, based on the reports of the guards that spoke then later to the police, he thought that this was just security measures, perhaps, for the cleric that he was going to interview. And so for many hours, he just accepted this. I know not not happily for sure. And then finally they pistol whipped him and they told him that he was a captive. And then we didn't know for several days, but that Sunday we got the photos. They're called sign of life photos. And we got these photos with Danny, with the newspaper, Dawn newspaper, the English newspaper in front of him as a sign of life of the date that the picture was taken, a gun to his head, his hand in shackles. And they came across digitally on email. They were sent across to reporters around the world. And so then that was the moment, Irina, that I saw, communications used for such diabolical means. The simple thing of email was now used to hide the identities of his captors. The email address for the captor was literally kidnapperguy@hotmail.com that sent out the ransom notes. And then days afterwards, Irina, that is when I really saw firsthand the power of propaganda and character assassination. In the newspaper, like literally in the Pakistani newspaper, was the report that Danny was Jewish. And that identity marker was used by the kidnappers then to flip their note in their ransom note and say that Danny was not actually just a spy for the CIA, but a spy for Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. And then, the shock of my life, we learned that a video had been made, and it had been made of Danny's last minutes on this earth. 3 men had walked into that compound carrying a bag, and in that bag were 2 weapons. One weapon was a knife that was used to literally sacrifice, as the word that they use, to behead Danny, to then cut his body into pieces. And the second weapon was a camera that was used to document this brutality, a brutality so disgusting that when they beheaded Danny, they held his head by the hair like a prize of barbarians. And these were just not ordinary barbarians in my life and in my world, because from the police interrogation of the guards, we learned that these men demanded that Danny proclaim his religious identity. And that is when he said these words: "My father is a Jew, my mother is a Jew, I am a Jew." And that is when he self-declared that his grandfather was one of the founders of the state of Israel, that he had lived in this town named Bnei Brak. And Danny proclaimed it. And in that video, I could see my friend, but he was also gone. But what he did in that moment, for me, in that moment, he transcended their brutality and he allowed his own humanity to express itself, speaking unapologetically about his identity and his life, knowing full well that these men could use it as an excuse to slay him, which is exactly what they then did. He didn't know what the consequence of these words would be. And then what we know from the guards who spoke to the police officers, including a brave Pakistani police officer named Fayaz Khan, who stood up for years against these kind of militants. The guard, a man by the name of Fazl Karim, told the police officer that the men who slayed and filmed Danny then washed the blood from the floor of this compound, and then they lay prayer rugs down in the direction of Mecca, the holy city of Muslims, and they prayed to God as if this act of theirs could ever have the blessing of any divine force in this world. But in their twisted ideology, they believed that they had done something so sacred that they could have the blessing of the heavens. And all of this I learned in the months and years after. But even without knowing it, that day that we found out about Danny's murder, changed my life. I was no longer going to just use these skills that I had learned at the Wall Street Journal to report about, Mile High Club and Tantra. I was going to take on this industry that had put into the world this ideology that justified the slaying of this beautiful human being. And so, Irina, that was the moment that I moved from the news pages in the months that came to the opinion pages. And I had a little, souvenir from Pakistan, because I learned in those weeks trying to find Danny that I was pregnant and I was not married. So I was a criminal according to the laws of Islam in Pakistan. And that's when I was born a Muslim feminist, fighting for equal rights and the dignity of women within my faith, and then the dignity of all people, so that an Islam of grace can exist in this world that will never slay a human being based on their identity. And that is, the journey that I then set out from this road. It's called Zamzama Boulevard, where I lived in Karachi. Zamzama is the word for this holy water that supposedly flows in Mecca. And it was from there that, flowed then this new purpose in my life.
That is an extremely moving story. And I literally have chills from listening to it. And the whole thing is still shocking to me today, not the least of it, not only because many of such crimes continue to happen, but because literally a lot of the people implicated in this horrific murder are still either out there or they've never been even investigated, because they've investigated the implementers, the actual kidnappers, but not really the people behind all of this. And even to the extent that some of them have been, imprisoned, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the people who've enabled him still walk free.
Yeah, that was this burden, that I also, and responsibility, really more than burden, a responsibility that I felt I left and carried with me after we left Karachi. I knew that there was a truth left behind. There was people, like you said, who were never arrested. And so that became one of my real missions, was to find out every single person who was involved in Danny's kidnapping and murder. And just like you referenced, we started this project at Georgetown University. It was a faculty student investigative project. I think it's a role model for great kind of work that we can do in collaboration in school campuses everywhere. It was kind of journalism class that I wish I could have had when I was a kid. But what we did is we had beats the FBI, Pakistani intelligence, State Department, and we followed every breadcrumb. And exactly, just like you said, they had arrested and convicted 4 people in the summer of 2002 in Danny's kidnapping and murder. But what we found was that the network was much wider. You know, it was also included the guards, the driver, the murderers, actually. And so that image that was in the film, the video, the murder video of the killer holding Danny's head, in it you could see the vein of the person's hand. And it's not admissible in court now, but our intelligence agencies and our law enforcement did pursue a matching of the vein, and it led them to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, along with his own confession. He was the man who, sitting in Pakistan, orchestrated the 9/11 attack. And so this man who was a part of, you know, the society in Pakistan gaining acceptance and support even for his radical, extremist, violent ideology, he had taken over the kidnapping of Danny because the Pakistani militants who had orchestrated it just were blown out of the water by all of the media coverage. They didn't know what to do. And so my reporting and the reporting of our project revealed that a current leader named Saif al-Adil in Al-Qaeda, another man who is out there in the world, he got a phone call to take over this operation. He handed it allegedly to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who brought in 2 relatives. And those 3 men are the men that walked into the compound in which Danny was held. One of the men, the cameraman, was a man by the name of Amr al-Baluchi. He was a nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's, and he is sitting also now in Guantanamo Bay for his participation in the 9/11 attacks. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is sitting there, but everybody knows this. It is now 2023, and those men have not even been convicted in the 9/11 attack. The U.S., system has allowed them to have defense after defense after defense. I wish that we could criminally prosecute them and have them disappear. But as a journalist, also, I went to Guantanamo. I went to, the depths of hell in order to complete this investigation. I wanted to see Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's hands. I wanted to see his eyes. We're separated from the courtroom by a glass pane, and we see the courtroom in front of us and then on video monitors. And Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, to this day, acts like he's the king. He sits in the front row of 5 rows of the high-value detainees that were behind the 9/11 attack, and he commands them. When they pray, they do not get to pray shoulder to shoulder, as is typical in mosque, but they pray lined up, row after row, and he stands as their prayer leader. That day, I saw him with his beard now reddened, like the extremists think that they are supposed to do to follow the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. And I thought to myself, how is this that our Guantanamo Bay system allows this man to dye his beard as a signal to militants everywhere of his piety? Because the U.S., the American Red Cross, I should say, the American Red Cross takes pictures, the sketchings go out. They know the propaganda they can still do as captives. And sure enough, he goes from being the Messiah to being Joe Jihadi. I mean, he's got all his looks that he's been playing out. Ultimately, there's only one that I wish him to have, which is just criminal, just as a criminal that is never to be heard of again. But alas, those trials continue. And it was there, Irina, that, you know, I learned something deeper, which I will share with everyone also, because I know, especially in the work that you do and the people who are listening to this, I know that many of you also see some of the worst of humanity. You know, you see deceit, you see lies, you see the worst of humanity expressed. And I did during that time of trying to understand what happened with Danny. And when I went down to the depths of hell, I came back with a realization, which was I couldn't bring Danny back. You know, I went on this journey and I couldn't bring him back. And yet what stayed with me was the grief, right? The grief and the trauma that I had never touched, because my brain is like probably yours, Irina, and like so many people listening, your brains are analytical, cognitive, you know, sometimes we don't want to touch that which hurts us. And so I came back and I learned that I needed to really face that grief and that sadness, and that the best way to honor my friend and was through the life that I continued to chart for goodness. And I continue to do that, you know, amidst everything that I do. His shining face is like a North Star for me, you know, always in my own meditation and reflection, a reminder to me of the values, you know, for which we fight. And that very much brings us, you know, into the modern day, because the values that his kidnappers and killers had are ones of sectarianism. They are ones of a hierarchy of human value. They are ones of intolerance and bigotry. And if we want to, you know, make this world a better place, as most of us want to do, we have to ask ourselves in each issue that we confront whether these regressive ideas are being promulgated, or are higher, you know, values being affirmed and perpetuated, like simple ones of humanism, equality, love, compassion, grace. You know, these are the ones that my parents raised me with. And in this upside down world, there are many, many people, just like you talk about, Irina, all the time. There are so many people who are going to use character assassination and disinformation to make you doubt yourself as you do your work. But I know for me, it is a daily meditation that the aspirational values are the ones guiding me, because those regressive values are the ones that slayed Danny. You know, they are the ones that were used to justify taking him from this earth. And so for me, those contrasts is, you know, the defining litmus test that I have in every project, every action, every speech, and every word that I also wrote into this book. You know, every word in this book is up against that test, like if it's affirming these higher values or being regressive. And so this is just a lesson that I learned in that process, Irina.
The saddest part about it is that there is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his ilk, they're symbols. They're not the decision makers. Even they who are higher up and who organize these horrific atrocities, you know, it doesn't end with them, because this ideology is funded, it's perpetuated. There's state and non-state actors behind it. And there's, you mentioned Saif al-Adil. He is now rumored to be the leader of Al-Qaeda. Iran has given him shelter, and rather than insisting that he is turned over to the US authorities, US continues to negotiate with Iran, and his name is hardly mentioned, and Iran's relationship with Al-Qaeda leaders is hardly mentioned, much less sufficiently investigated. So all these individuals, their networks, it's not just individuals are not meeting justice where they should, but this entire scheme, this ideology, this relationship, everything that made that crime possible, that it serves some political agendas that are supposed to benefit us all, but yet these types of ideologues are allowed to continue and succeed and grow in stature. So
Right.
we have not actually made much progress. Arresting a few low-level pawns has not solved the real problem behind it. And
Yes, agreed.
and they've created networks in the West just as much as over there, and those networks too are funded and functional. And this is some of the work that you have been helping uncover and investigate, because these mouthpieces, they ultimately harken back to the hierarchy of those serving this ideology. They are the stepping stones to the leadership. Can you tell us how you got involved into uncovering these networks and confronting this propaganda here?
Yeah, and you put it so well. I just want to thank you for that, because exactly, the kidnapping and murder of Danny involved, 36 men, but those 36 men are part of a history, right, of ideology and then of operational networks. I didn't know this concept of social network analysis, but boy, do I know it now. And it is a family tree to me always. It's a family tree of ideas and people. And so, behind me are the books. They're the books that are the timeless books of these ideologues. And they have exploited, the freedoms in the West in order to push their terrible ideas. So what happened for me is when I came back to the United States after Danny's murder, I had the joy of bringing into the world my baby. Made in Pakistan, a souvenir from Pakistan, as my niece said with the joke. I raised him in the first years in West Bygod, Virginia, with my parents as an incredible, incredible support. And just like a lot of people, facing tragedy, I turned to religion and spirituality for solace. And I went with sincerity in my heart to Saudi Arabia, if you can believe it. I went with my son. He was just a few months old. And I was curious. I wanted to know from where this ideology, that slayed my friend, from where did it come? I had to walk that land. And when I walked it, I saw too the contradictions, the contradictions of a history in which the prophet of Islam was this man by the name of Muhammad, but his first believer and his really patron was his wife named Khadija, 20 years older. Before her, it was a single mother named Hajar, who had been abandoned in what is modern day Saudi Arabia by her husband, as Muslims call him, Abraham. In Christianity and Judaism, Sarah is not she's the first wife, but the only wife of Abraham. But in Islam, when this young woman named Hagar, or Hajar, as she's called in Islam, has a baby with Abraham, they had to put a ring on it, right, to borrow from the song, and she became a wife. But she was sent. Nobody disputes between the three religions, the story anyway, right? The story that she was left in Mecca. So I thought to myself, as I am now walking in the footsteps of Hajar, with my little baby upon my chest, I think to myself, I have inherited this feminine spirit. I have inherited, and I feel it very personally because there was no 24-hour Walmart in Mecca at the time. It was only the kicking of baby Ishmael into the desert that this water named Zamzam, supposedly came forth. So I thought this, and I thought, but how did we get to this place where women have less property rights, they have less inheritance rights? And I mulled this. And something strange happened in Saudi Arabia also. In Mecca, there was no front door or back door to the sacred mosque there. I walked in with my dad and my nephew and my mom and niece equal, with my little baby as a single mother upon my chest. And I prayed next to my father, shoulder to shoulder. Well, I came back to America and a new mosque was opening in Morgantown, my hometown. So I walked up to the front door, a green door, and I had my baby with me, just like I had had in Mecca. But this time, an elder from Egypt stood there and he reprimanded me and he said, "Sister, take the back door." And so there in my hometown of Morgantown, West Virginia, where I had run as a Morgantown High Mohegan, learned my journalism, I was being told I couldn't walk through the front door and I had to go around the corner by the garbage dumpster and walk up this rickety staircase to the back door, which I was to discover was more often locked than unlocked. So, Irina, I had to make a decision, a split-second decision. It was like the kind of decisions that we all sometimes have to make on which path we're going to take. And I said, "No, brother, I'll walk this way." And I walked in through the front door. And I went up the front staircase into the main hall. And there I saw this huge space with chandelier light and books and more resources than the women got upstairs in the balcony. And so in that moment, I recognized that interpretation of Islam that judged and shamed my friend for his identity, it was doing the same, for us as women. And that's when I was born a Muslim feminist, fighting for equal rights, standing up for the civil rights laws that we had passed in the United States that said, separate is unequal. And what I faced then, Irina, was this machine. I just couldn't even believe it. This machine of Muslim organizations and elders who told me to stop speaking up about this. I sent email after email. My father was on the mosque board and he literally wept in the kitchen, Irina, saying, "Please make room for our daughters." Because my dad understood that, if you're going to move forward, you have to make room for everybody in the community. Well, they refused. My dad was forced off the board. They put me on trial at the mosque, shaming me to see if I should be banned from the mosque. It was literally out of a chapter of, the Scarlet Letter. And of course, unspoken was the fact that they judged me also for being a single mother without a wedding ring. And my son and I were reminders, to them also of decisions that they have made, but for which they have never had to have consequences. So Irina, in that moment, I started writing more about the issue of women's rights at mosques. And lo and behold, these attacks started happening. I had supported my friend Danny. I respect and honor the state of Israel as having a legitimate right to exist. So blogs started emerging by anonymous characters with names like Dr. Maxter. And I was called a Zionist media whore, told that I had this, list of sexually transmitted diseases. They were all defamation. It was all character assassination. And what was the intention? This is what I have learned from the great work of, the researchers that do character assassination analysis, like our friends at George Mason University. These are the tactics that have been used since the beginning of time. They were used against Eve in the story of Adam and Eve. They were used against Joan of Arc, Cleopatra, and these are our female leaders, right? And through time, and of course, it's across to men, of course, also. But I will tell you, I am here to also testify to the fact that the tactics of character assassins is not, simply to reverberate across the world in a discrediting campaign, but it is to have their words absorb into your own spirit and into your own soul, forcing you to fear the world's shame, for you to second guess yourself, to feel insecurity. And I will tell you that it works. I will never forget the day that I was about to go to the mosque for my trial. And I lay in my bed in fetal position, paralyzed. And I was paralyzed not only as a human being, right, but as a writer. And I want to tell you, Irina, do you know who stood outside in the hallway? It was my mom. And my mom stood there. And she had on this hoodie that she would wear to go into the mosque with me, so she could pull up the hood as her hijab. And she had Brooklyn across the front. It was a hoodie that I had gotten as a gift for my nephew, and she'd inherited it. And she told me, Asra, you don't live in some village. Do not live with their shame. And she went with me to this ridiculous trial. And she stood with me. My father stood with me. And so I just want to give people that encouragement, the encouragement to stay true to your values and surround yourself with even one or two people who have strength and clarity, like my mother and my father have been to me. But I'm going to share with you something that nobody gets to see. I ended up, this is now you're going to get to see how I work, and exactly to the point of what you say. This right here is just a window into exactly the kind of network that you're talking about, Irina. That moment of attack on me sent me down that investigative path. And the book, I try to take people into that chart through the stories of people and these experiences from the trenches, these human experiences. And what it leads to is this spider's web, just like you said, Irina. And one of the important findings in my book is that, indeed, just like you said, in the 1980s, these immigrants had come from Islamist movements that believe in the idea of political Islam. They created a hub right down the road from me, Irina. It just gives me chills sometimes to think about the fact that my home is one short Uber ride away at a place called 500 Grove Street. It's a chapter in the book. And at that building, they built the network. They bought a chicken factory that would help fund their business work. They turned it halal. They made it technologically halal also with a, assembly line system. They created political action committees, investment funds, built a network of mosques, publishing houses. And that is the network that has born organizations like the Council on American Islamic Relations, the International Institute of IIT. It's just like is happening in my brain right now. They make it so confusing, so you can't even remember the word salad that makes up their names. But they are the network that has done propaganda now against Muslim reformers like myself who challenge the ideology of political Islam. Anybody who supports us, so that includes atheists and liberals like Sam Harris and Bill Maher, Richard Dawkins. It includes the number one enemy that they have had that drove their formation, the state of Israel, and the Jews that support the state of Israel. And now their campaign is directed at my home country of India, where they are using their propaganda tactics to make India the new Israel. And if you can believe this, Irina, just last week, one of their organizations named Sound Vision, they make their names very appealing, put out a report on the Nazification of India. So they are hijacking, critical, just tragic moments from Jewish history to now adopt them for their own political purpose. And in this case, what they want to do is they want the world to turn against the many Hindus that live in India, the many Hindus that are in the diaspora, vilify the nation of India. And what is the goal? To lay claim to the Muslims that are my brethren and my families, right? Because India is going to have one of the largest, India has one of the largest populations of Muslims in the world, but it will soon be the largest population of Muslims in the world. And they are also intent on trying to claim the state of Kashmir, just like they have used the issue of Palestinians for their own vilification of Israel. And so the network is vast, just like you said, and their goals are diabolical and intent on supporting the notion of Islamism or political Islam in governance. And we see their supporters being nations like Turkey and Qatar now, and Pakistan also, along with, just like you said, state and non-state actors, and I wrote the book because I wanted people to be inoculated to their tactics. So they're not shamed and silenced, but actually educated and confident when they confront their propaganda.
It's very funny you say that, but it is hard to fight the forces when the US government, when European governments not only do not fight them, but embrace them as valuable allies. When Qatar is elevated to the status of the, of the major non-NATO ally, when the US engages with Pakistan on the counterterrorism dialogue, as Pakistan is engulfed in a series of terrorist attacks it has failed to prevent because it was cultivating some of those very same people. When Turkey claims it's fighting counterterrorism, fighting terrorists, but has opened the doors to ISIS during its own confrontations with the Kurds in Syria, when it invites IRGC to abduct dissidents from its territory. All of these things make it, are contradictory and make it very hard to understand what are we supposed to stand for, because US officially embraces all of these countries, engages and legitimizes these policies by continuing to dialogue with them and by not actively fighting them. Indeed, if you go to Congress, even the most security-oriented members of Congress, and you confront them about Muslim Brotherhood or political Islam, will tell you that they cannot do much because those ideologies have legitimacy to them, that the social jihad helps people, that it is not the role of the political class, government officials in the US to rule on ideology and so on and so forth. So how are we supposed to confront these ideas when all our institutions are geared towards enabling them?
Yes, so well put. I think you've convinced me to be sure I just devote my life to gardening now, because you're so right. I mean, the forces that we're up against are so formidable, and we cannot expect the government oftentimes to give us support. They have, in fact, sabotaged our efforts so often. I cannot even tell you how frustrating it is that these same players that are, perpetuating this propaganda, supporting these Islamist regimes, are given these grants for, quote, countering violent extremism, right? CVE. They are in charge of our State Department disinformation campaigns against extremism, when in fact, they are enabling the extremists that is Islamism. And the values of Islamism are so un-American. That's what's just the greatest tragedy to me, is the idea that we have any kind of relationship of even negotiation with governments like Iran and even the Afghanistan now. It's, and Pakistan, many moments in its own, subterfuge about the real values and beliefs that they're putting out in the world. Like it's very, very frustrating. But I know that if we don't do it, then we will for sure be defeated, and that if we do fight them, that we have some hopes of winning. And I do know that it is not sustainable. Repression and tyranny are not sustainable. The example for me that gives me greatest hope right now is the way that the people of Iran and the women of Iran have been able to change the narrative about the government of Iran and the regime there. I mean, in my lifetime, I have seen the far left organizations like Code Pink, fighting war and then organizing field trips to Iran with their pink scarves, now signaling their acceptance of these values of Islamism, while they do pictures, with the heads of state in Iran and dignitaries there. And that's why, the cover of the book was very shocking to me, even when I first saw it. But the idea of the Islamic flag there with the far left in this challenge that we face is true. And it's also not as stark, because what we also face are people in political parties, just like you said, politicians, that are enabling this Islamism, this repressive ideology. And that is really frustrating. And I know that that unfortunately too, they are well funded, and they have these foreign governments supporting their efforts. Just today, we have an army of lobbyists being fanned out through Capitol Hill today, as we speak, by that organization that I had mentioned, Sound Vision. that is funded, from various interests down the road from me in Northern Virginia. And what are they doing? They are using the shield of this concept called Islamophobia to stop any criticism of Islamism or extremism within the Islam. And they are using it to cover up, for the anti-Semitism of politicians like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, for their strong, just we can see biased, analysis about what is happening in Israel. Those two politicians are turning on India also, and they are using that shield of Islamophobia to shut people up. And so that's in part why I also wrote the book, because that attack was used on me as a character assassination tactic. And it is now the tactic of governments. I have followed the money. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation funded this movement to use Islamophobia to protect their governments since 2015, 2005. It's been a constant refrain. And it brings me, to the tactics that are being used on the far left today of race as a way to shut people up about, the criticisms of overreach by the far left. And so the mechanism is all very similar, and one that we have to just continue to analyze if we're going to actually overcome it and win. Like I'm only in it to win it. Honestly, I'm only in this to win our world back. And I want everybody to have that same level of hope and commitment despite all these forces that we face.
You mentioned a very important thing, the fact that these people are not operating by themselves, but they in conjunction with other ideologies that lend them support and legitimacy and make it much harder to confront them. Because if you only had one thing, then maybe the politicians would get on board. But given the sheer amount of lobbying and propaganda and in light of other threats as well, this becomes very difficult to prioritize. And quite simply, they've been very good at suppressing any sort of information that would make them a priority, especially in the current political climate. So that brings me to the question: how did you go from mapping and confronting local Islamists at your mosque to confronting and uncovering this entire network and their leftist apologists and enablers?
Wow. So I was here in my home, and I took my son right after the tragedy of the Boston Marathon attack in 2013 down to a baseball field called Nike Field. And that season, my son happened to be a Boston Red Sox and his little league team. Well, in a moment of slow moment during the game, I was checking my emails. And when I checked my emails, I saw this shocking article that accused me of enabling Islamophobia. And it was by somebody that I knew very well. He's a professor of Islam named Omid Safi. And I had met him as a Muslim feminist. He called himself a, quote, progressive Muslim. But now all of a sudden, he was attacking me. And why? Because I had gone to the home of this man named Ruslan Sarnev. He was the uncle of the Sarnev brothers. And at that moment, just days earlier from the baseball game, the Sarnev brothers were still on the loose. America's police and FBI were looking for them. And so I heard that Mr. Sarnev lived up the road from me in Maryland. So I went to his home, and there I saw many other journalists who had the same idea. So Uncle Ruslan, as he became known, came out of his home wearing a polo shirt. He had just sandals on and jeans, and he had a sternness in his face. And he told his nephews to come out of hiding. And I was like, wow, he's just straight on. This is shocking to me. And he said something else really important, just in plain speak. Somebody asked about what motivated him to do this. And he said, because, this is the correct position to take. And I asked whether he was Muslim, because I didn't know from his name exactly. And he said he was and his nephews were. And I asked from the side whether it was a radical ideology that had indoctrinated his nephews. And he did something remarkable. He said it had. They had been radicalized. And then, to top it all off, he said about his nephews, they are losers. Like, that's not a nice word always, but they were at that point alleged murderers, right? And his point was a deeper one, which is that they were chasing this losing ideology, this losing mentality, and they had embraced it. And so I penned this column, Irina, for the Washington Post. And in it, I said that Uncle Ruslan had accomplished more in his driveway press conference, impromptu as it was, than the Muslim establishment organizations had done in the decade plus 2 years since the 9/11 attack. And I named names, and I said that the Council on American Islamic Relations had also failed us as Muslims. They had failed me as a Muslim feminist. They had never supported me in my rights for equal rights in the mosque. When I asked them for help as a civil rights organization, they told me, oh, Asra, go find a new mosque. And it was their spokesman, their communications guy, who told me, we just do American Islamic relations. We don't do Islamic relations. Well, after my article was published, Omid Safi wrote his little blog, and in it, he alleged Islamophobia as my crime. Well, I'm not an Islamophobe. I'm a Muslim. I believe in a strict interpretation of Islam as anathema to the values of humanity. And that is because of my love of my religion that I fight for it. Well, the news service, supported by the University of Missouri's journalism school, if you can believe it, and an organization called Religion News Writers, they argued with me back and forth. And Irina, it was literally back here in my bedroom. I remember I crumbled to the ground weeping, because at that point now, Omid Safi had unleashed another army of character assassins against me. And now they were going after my son. And they were using the bastard term against him, another form of character assassination against a human being. It just was like the knife that they wanted to put into my heart. It was that experience for me. And not only that, they went after my friend Danny, right? They went after him. They blamed him for his own murder. They disparaged him as a Jew and as a son of Israel. So it was heartbreaking. And these words that they said, that's why, what I told everybody earlier is from my lived experience, as the far left likes to talk about. It's from my lived experience where I know that the tactics of character assassination and shame are not just for the outside, but for inside your mind. And I took my son this time a few days later to a basketball game. When I emerged from the basketball game, those words were ringing. That's what they intend. They want it to be echoes inside of our soul and our spirit. I remember that the rain was pouring so hard and I could hardly see where I was driving because I also just started weeping. So between the rain, like the heavens crying, and my own tears, I was struggling to drive. And like a good, girl that grew up in West Virginia, I saw the Dairy Queen, and I said, let me get my son an ice cream. Let me get myself a banana split blizzard to soothe these tears. And I pulled into the parking lot just right across Route 7 from me here, a corridor that is called Wahhabi Corridor, because of all of the outposts of puritanical Islam that have made their home here in Northern Virginia. And that was when my son put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Stop crying, Mom. They're terrorists of the mind." And he was just 10, Irina, and I heard in him, a wisdom that I couldn't even have come to myself because I was so absorbed in the pain. But my son could see it, and I wiped away those tears. I got us banana split blizzard, and I started the investigation. I went from that moment, Irina, from being the hunted to the hunter. And what I discovered is that the folks at Religion News Service, they relented finally, and they took down this character assassination of me. But Omid Safi had another place that he could go, and it's a website called loonwatch.com. It was created to identify the so-called loons, or crazy people in society who are, quote, Islamophobic. And what he did is he got an anonymous blogger named Emperor to just repost his article, smearing me. And so I thought to myself, I am going to find out the identity of Emperor. And at that time, I was just beginning to learn about the field of character assassination. It was in the years to come that I then met you, Irina, that I met Sergey, who is one of the leaders of this field of character assassination at George Mason University. And I thought of this possible tactic, a legal, they call it law warfare, right? I've learned where, and this is what I did. I filed a defamation lawsuit in Fairfax County Court against my John Doe assailants. And I used an article that was published, fast forward 4 years later, on Loon Watch, accusing me and other Muslim reformers, including Zuhdi Jasser, a Syrian-American physician, Raheel Raza, a Pakistani-Canadian writer and journalist, and many others, of being funded by the government of Israel. So it's again that hate of Jews that is supposed to then translate into a hate of us. And I knew that was a lie. And as a journalist, I knew that only truth is the defense for libel, and that this website was now engaging in libel and defamation. And so I filed my own complaint, what they call pro se, on my own. And in it, I also named the internet service providers that were giving these anonymous character assassins a platform. And who were they? Places like Facebook, Google, that had a blogging platform, Twitter, and also one named GoDaddy, which is an internet service provider that allows you to register domain names. I learned through this process that's called a whois search that anybody can do for free on any website that GoDaddy had the domain. Now, the owners had made it a private registration, so I couldn't see who had registered it by name. But what a lawsuit allows you to do then is it allows you to subpoena the internet service providers to get the records on the clients that are using their platform, even anonymously. And there's something really amazing that I learned. A lawyer here in Northern Virginia named Andy Galou had also been the target of character assassination in a platform here called Fairfax Underground. She could not unmask her assassins within the 1-year statute of limitations for a defamation lawsuit. So you know what she did? She changed the law. And there's a law called Andy's Law in Virginia. And once you file your lawsuit, it stops the clock. So you have as much time as you need to be able to unmask your character assassins. And if I could, I'm going to just read to all of you one little passage that is so revealing about what we uncovered. So it's chapter 6, and it's called Launching a Disinformation Website. So at 8:38 p.m. on April Fool's Day 2009. So just imagine, remember, I had been hunted for many years since I'd walked in through the front door of my mosque in 2003. And then by 2009, something happened. And then 2013 is when I started trying to uncover these people. So just think about the number of years that have passed in this campaign. So at 8:38 p.m. on April Fool's Day 2009, a young man used the name Zuhair Thomas to register a new account at GoDaddy, one of the many new internet service providers that had emerged in the 1990s. Zuhair Thomas was shopper ID 27179307 in GoDaddy's system, according to hundreds of pages of documents I received in response to subpoenas filed as part of a defamation lawsuit. So it was like Christmas when I got this USB with these documents, but I got them. The back end documents to this account of shopper ID 27179307 who had launched loonwatch.com. He put his address as 1200 Market Street in Philadelphia. It's a Lowe's Hotel in downtown Philadelphia. The phone number he provided was for the hotel's front desk. So he was masking his identity. He used a Muslim first name, Zuhair, an Anglo-Saxon last name, Thomas. Had someone read GoDaddy's internal shopper info files, and I read them, they would have read verified by fraud department, customer okay. And then Irina and friends, this is what I learned. He was part of a stealthy network of anonymous cyber hitmen who had decided to expand the Honor Brigade, this campaign that I had dubbed the Honor Brigade to protect the so-called honor of Islam, by targeting the West, Israel, Muslim reformers, and anyone who got in their way using their new secret website. In order number 161790480, they bought the domain name loonwatch.com from GoDaddy and designed the website to look like an online magazine. What they had in mind was no joke. Research proves that the more lies are believed, the more they are repeated. This is what I learned from you, Irina, from your work and from the work of so many great experts in communications and propaganda. like my friend Nancy Snow also. The act of dehumanizing enemies through character assassination also serves an important purpose of denying opponents any moral authority or claim to decency, respect, and civility. The campaign called for Loon Watch operatives to disseminate negative disinformation about Muslim reformers, critics of Islamic extremism, and others in ways that could not be tracked back to their real identities, employers, or organizational affiliations. They had one anonymous, quote, admin identity, and then unfamiliar names. And guess what they were? The names of fish. Such slippery work these guys were doing as the names for their fake accounts: Emperor, Garibaldi, Mooneye, Danios, Zingle, Darter. Those were just a few. And what I learned was that Zuhair Thomas was actually, and is actually, Muhammad Tausif Akbar, Research Director at the Council on American Islamic Relations, Chicago chapter. And in that documentation, I found the receipts, the literal receipts for the payments for this customer that had bought loonwatch.com, spencerwatch.com to go after an author named Robert Spencer, even a website called islamophobiasucks.com. And who was it? The credit card goes back to a man named Ahmed Rehab, the executive director of the Council on American Islamic Relations Chicago chapter. And so there, this organization, founded out of the network at 500 Grove Street, established a domestic disinformation and character assassination campaign against its perceived enemies, the United States of America, the state of Israel, the state of India, and anyone who challenged their worldview. The Council on American Islamic Relations responded to a subpoena request that I made to Twitter, Irina. And they said that they were responding to people who had been part of the defendants in my lawsuit. So they emerged as defenders of this character assassination and disinformation campaign. And I agree with you 100% what you said at the very beginning. This must be headline news in our country, because this organization has used deceptive tactics in order to discredit voices in our country and in the world. One of the character assassins I have identified as a physician, Javed Hashmi. He used the name Danios, and he has now also publicly admitted this. And he used the name Danios in order to also raise money through a website called Indiegogo.com while he was getting his PhD at Harvard University. So they are exploiting the freedoms in the United States to wage war on the United States. My mom, who knows this culture very well, she told me, even when you expose them, Asra, they will be shameless. And indeed, that has been the response of Javed Hashmi. He first tried to gaslight me, Irina. Oh, I never said anything bad about you. And then when I refused his gaslighting, he turned on me within 24 hours. And where does he work now? He's a strategic communications person at another organization called the Muslim Public Affairs Council. So what do I want? I want folks to read the book fully in order to understand the dynamics of this woke army and inoculate yourself, and don't allow them to hijack your mind, your empathy, your kindness, your intellect, because their values are counter to the values of humanity and decency and goodness. And remember that always. And so, Irina, I just can't even begin to tell you how happy I am to share this with you and your viewers and listeners, because you've been with me, since the beginning. You have been one of the few brave people who have taken on these state actors and non-state actors. And I just want to, honor that work that you've done also, because you and I haven't talked, throughout this whole process as I've been doing my digging and everything, but you've always been speaking to me, in my head, giving me encouragement. And I just want you to know that, because sometimes we don't know that about the contribution that we give in other people's lives. So thank you for, educating other people, and informing everyone about this dynamic of this network, and giving me the space to be able to then come and share it with you as somebody who hears it, with an open mind and open heart and support. And I just believe that, we can do it. We can expose them, and we can ultimately dismantle their networks. I just have confidence that you and I can do it, and everybody else that's with us.
And to that end, you bring up a very important point. You gave the positions of these people. So these individuals, they will claim that they were not acting as representatives of the organization, that they were acting in their personal capacity with whatever they're doing. But it cannot be a coincidence that a number of these officials were simultaneously coordinating these nicknames, these aliases that they've adopted, and engaging in this collusive action against you without oversight and approval of the organizational network. So they were, in fact, they claim that they were not representing CARE, but it's very obvious that this would not be possible without a collusion of interest between this organization and these private, supposedly private activity on the side. How is it possible to bring together this organizational responsibility for these character assassination attacks? It's important to of course highlight the individuals responsible for these actions, but the fact that the organizations gave them professional cover is no less scandalous.
Absolutely. I love how you keep us focused on holding these actors accountable. And I want to dream up with you and others an accountability campaign. I want us to hold not only the organizations accountable, but their so-called interfaith partners, their institutional partners, Harvard University, and every other institution that gives them cover. What I have in the book is the fact that organizations like the gazillionaire George Soros's Open Society Network funded many programs by the Council on American Islamic Relations and the Muslim Public Affairs Council. There are donors, philanthropists, foundations that are giving all of these shenanigans cover. And I want to highlight a couple actors that I think it's really important for us to know in order to sort of recognize how big this is. So after Javad Hashmi admitted in the end of 2021, in just a little tweet after a debate with this author, Robert Spencer, that he was Danios, there's one interesting tweet that came right afterwards, and it was by a man by the name of Shahid Amanullah. Shahid Amanullah grew up and lived on a street, coincidence perhaps, named Dorado, one of the nicknames for the bloggers in this Loon Watch network. And Shahid Amanullah said in his tweet, this is a secret that he has kept for a decade about the identity of this Loon Watch creator named Danios. So our admission from this man named Shahid Amanullah becomes very interesting when you know what his job was. He was a tech entrepreneur, born into the explosion of Silicon Valley. And he loved creating websites, created a website about how to find the best halal food restaurant in your neighborhood, how to find a mosque, loved creating websites, so many to his name. Well, he then gets a job in the Obama administration as a senior technology advisor at the State Department. And when was that? Right after the creation of the Loon Watch. And it was during his work at the State Department that he knew full well what this campaign was doing with domestic disinformation. And what was one of Shahid Amanullah's tasks at the State Department? And this speaks exactly, Irina, to your point earlier about the machine we're up against. The Obama administration, if everyone remembers, was having this dance and relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, literally in Egypt. Tahrir Square was exploding. And who is it that the Obama administration supported because of the lobbying of these organizations that, just like you said, the Muslim Brotherhood is our best alternative for partners for, quote, democracy in Muslim countries? It was the Muslim Brotherhood that the Obama administration was propping up. And who was supporting that? Shahid Amanullah out of the State Department and his network of similar-minded Muslim leaders that were now new power brokers within the Obama administration. And what was it that we were then facing as Muslim reformers? We were facing a new narrative by the Obama administration in which, if people remember, Islamic State emerged and President Obama stood there and said, there's nothing Islamic about the Islamic State, which was laughable considering it was in the name, right? But it was individuals like Shahid Amanullah who are doing deflection for the Muslim Brotherhood and these Islamist regimes. Money is involved here, big money. Shahid Amanullah leaves the State Department to become a venture capitalist, building big businesses with big investors. And that is the work that he's doing today. All the while having now admitted that he was well aware of this domestic disinformation campaign. That's diabolical. That is the weaponization of government, big tech, against people. And then who else did we have as key players supporting Loon Watch and its disinformation campaign? An individual by the name of Reza Aslan, an Iranian-American author who weaponized the concept of Islamophobia in 2010. As remember, Loon Watch is putting its disinformation out in the blogosphere. He weaponized Islamophobia to try to push for the acceptance of the Ground Zero Mosque. If people remember the attempts to try to build that mosque, to shut people up. And who was he representing? But a lot of interests from overseas that were also supporting this Ground Zero Mosque building. He uploaded a video in which he said, I love Loon Watch. And he supported a fundraising campaign by Stephen Danios on another platform called Indiegogo, because Danios said he was going to write a book. And guess what I was able to get, Irina, in my subpoenas? I subpoenaed Indiegogo and I got the receipts. $8,000 that Danios picked up from donors with the support of Reza Aslan And I have the, disbursement column in the Excel spreadsheet that I got to Javad Hashmi's bank account. And then another example would be a writer by the name of Wajahat Ali. He was just an up-and-coming playwright when I first met him in the early 2000s. He was always checking in with me about contacts that I had at the Daily Beast and Washington Post, and I'd always try to support him because he too presented himself as a progressive Muslim. And sure enough, he too was supporting this Loon Watch effort, secret disinformation campaign. And what were these folks able to accomplish in these 2 decades since the 9/11 attacks? They went from people recognizing that there was a strain of Islam that was extremist and diabolical to today, people being afraid to even talk about that issue. And they have shifted the conversation to the greatest domestic threat being the phenomena of white supremacy. And that's why I began this conversation, talking about how it is that my parents literally lived under white supremacy. And the most freedom that they have ever known in this world, and that they could ever know, and that I could ever know in any Muslim country, is surpassed by what we experience in the United States of America. The threat of Islamic extremism is very real. And what these guys have been able to do through their 20-year disinformation campaign is not only create a shield for the extremists and the Islamists, but now, just like we show with the book cover, create this partnership with the left in America. And not only the left, they have penetrated the Democratic Party through political contributions, through leverage, through persuasive campaigns that they are the only Muslims that the Democratic Party should engage with. And what have they done? They have used this new ideology of wokeism that pushes race as, the explanation for all dynamics in society as a way to legitimize themselves. And really importantly, it's so important to understand that that concept that I was saying before, the very beginning, that we should not accept a hierarchy of human value. It is the one that I was born into, right, in India. It is one that critical race theory and the new ideology of wokeism perpetuate. They create a new hierarchy of human value. And in that game, the oppression matrix, what the Islamists are doing is they are turning Jewish people into white oppressors. They are turning Israelis into agents of white privilege and using the language of intersectionality to demand, for example, that Israeli Jewish feminists be excluded from the Women's March in 2017, right? So this marriage, this unholy alliance, is being used to perpetuate this new hierarchy of human value. And just like I was saying earlier, whenever that happens, like, we have to just see it clearly. It is a hierarchy of human value that justified Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the other alleged killers of my dear friend to slay him. It was a hierarchy of human value that allows and allowed Islamic State to kill Christians, and people who are Muslim also that didn't believe in their interpretation of Islam. Muslim supremacy is real in this world, and that is a fundamental value of Islamism or political Islam. So this blind eye that the Islamists are trying to get Americans to accept, to their injustices and their racism and their bigotry, is something that we should not fall for. That's the fundamental battle that we're in today, is that we stick to our values and we pierce the disinformation and the character assassination wherever we see it, call it out, and definitely don't let it get into your head, because just as my son said to me years ago, they are terrorists of the mind, and it's our minds that are our greatest weapons against them.
Now, you mentioned Wajahat Ali. That name rings a bell to me because he was initially this liaison that was supposed to be working with Jewish organizations. It all ended in a huge scandal when his own organizations eventually, did not want to have anything to do with even public whitewashing of their own ideology through such alliances. It was a complete embarrassment, and later I've seen him coordinating communications on various issues with Qatari and Islamist propagandists on Twitter. But the bigger question I want to ask you is, has there been any evidence of active coordination of communications, funding, or any other activity specifically between this network of private organizations and the Obama administration? Not simply knowledge of or awareness, but actual evidence of coordination, collusion, or any signaling that indicated state level approval.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up Wajahat Ali again, because the rest of the story with him is that he was able to use these various battles, including the one that you mentioned related to the state of Israel, plus the dirty work that the character assassins were doing, to win himself a role as a contributing columnist now to the New York Times. So they took the tactics of the dodgy and the shady to then legitimize themselves in American media channels. So that another character that we could reference is a man by the name of Mehdi Hassan, who some people may know as a host today of a show on MSNBC. But we in the Muslim community know him very well as a rabid ideologue within the Shia community in the United Kingdom, very homophobic and anti-West, anti-anybody who didn't accept his belief system. And yet here he is, able to catapult into the main stage of the United States. And so it is this convergence of interests. But you absolutely asked the correct question. And the individuals and the places where I saw the greatest coordination and evidence of the coordination is with this role that the State Department also created of an ambassador to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And so that individual who was there during the Obama administration worked very closely coordinating the use of Islamophobia as a defense and shield for these Islamist governments. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation was founded in the 1960s out of the birth of Israel and as an attempt to and the defeat in the 1967 war, in an attempt to coordinate literally Muslim countries against the state of Israel. And it has been used now to try to support these Islamist nations. So this Ambassador Rashid, as he was called, has been involved with them in that way. There has been absolute money flowing to the IIIT, as it's known here in Herndon, Virginia, from foreign governments. Those are much harder to track down, but the evidence that I have been able to establish is by, for example, this Muslim Brotherhood sympathizer within the royal family in Saudi Arabia that many people might be aware of Prince bin Talal, who has now become out of favor within the royal family of today, but it was his money that was funneled through this triple IT that Georgetown University was then able to establish and fund their Bin Talal Center on Christian Muslim understanding. They intentionally excluded Jews from that name and from their work. And it was then money from the triple IT that went to Georgetown University that I document in the book that has funded this effort called the Bridge Initiative that is every day putting out something that they call Islamophobia Watch. And it is designed to run cover for these Islamist governments. The executive director of that Bin Talal Center is a man by the name of Jonathan Brown. Sounds like a, American enough name. Who he is actually is the husband of a woman named Layla Al-Aryan, and her father, Sami Al-Aryan, was deported from the United States after many years of litigation for alleged terrorism financing. Where did he find a home? Turkey. And now through him and through Jonathan Brown, his son-in-law, we see more alliances, for the Islamist regime in Turkey of Erdogan, working in concert with Qatar. Saudi Arabia has become a more complicated story, right? And as many people know, where they are actually have that opposition with that Turkey-Qatar alliance. But ultimately, this is the reporting that we've got to continue doing, Irina. We have to continue following the money. I love the foreign registration documents that we get in the US, but as you know, everybody tries to hide their foreign influence. And this is the reporting that we've still got to do. There's going to be a sequel and a sequel and a sequel to this first Woke Army book, because I'm not ending it with this investigation for myself. There are so many diabolical networks, and we've seen evidence of this with the government of Iran, the regime in Iran, working with lobbying groups like this organization with the acronym NIAC, NIAC, that has been, doing character assassinations of good Iranian dissidents and noble, strong women like Masih Alinejad, who has been fighting for women's rights and human rights in Iran. So these regimes are working with their proxies here in the United States, and we have to just keep doing our hard work and investigating and bringing the proof and the receipts to the American public and to lawmakers and government officials, and kind of throw a lot of spaghetti on the wall, to use that analogy, and really just keep working and working and working until something sticks. And because it's as we all suspect, I ended up with the title of Woke Army for the book, but the other titles that I was working with was this other word, insidious, because that really captures their operations.
There is one point that what you just said reminded me of, and that is a lot of these operations are very deceptive, very manipulative, and very high level, and they're able to manipulate minds, and sometimes they use people who almost seem critical of their activity as useful dupes and as their own agents, in fact. So they use people who are who are anti-Islam, for instance, to discredit any legitimate criticism of Islamism and political Islam and violence and subversive ideologies. These tactics are not new, but they are not. They have not been invented by the Muslim Brotherhood or Khomeinis or any of those circles. They are most widely associated with Russia and the Soviet Union. And I was wondering, and Muslim Brotherhood is officially banned in Russia, but we've seen plenty of evidence of Russia coordinating with whoever they wish whenever it fits their agenda, including some of the radicalized Chechens, like or which the Tsarnaev brothers are only a minor example. So my question to you is, have you seen any evidence besides the usual suspects, Qatar, Turkey, and so forth, of Russian involvement or Russian hand in all of this? It probably wouldn't be direct, but have you noticed anything that might indicate a wider network than what meets the eye?
Yeah, I am so curious about it, and I'm going to put it on my radar to investigate. The reason why we ended up with the hammer and sickle in this alliance is because what is happening in the United States is something that is so diabolical, and I again need to keep doing reporting, but what I can see in the trickle down, is that, as just like a lot of people have seen, the idea of socialism has been branded as democratic socialism, right? But really, it is a new tyranny upon people. And it has also entered into American politics through organizations like Justice Democrats, which has been built up as an alternative, quote, progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But it is that Justice Democrats movement that birthed Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib as political candidates, along with Alejandro Ocasio-Cortez, So we see the impact of that idea of socialism, if not, the actual brand of communism, right, coming into American politics. And I have so many examples of it that I have shockingly seen. I was very careful to not just be engaged in anything that I didn't see evidence of, but one of the ways that we've really dramatically seen this in the United States today is how this alliance has entered into K through 12 education. What is happening now is that 2020 and the killing of George Floyd and the new racial awakening brought opportunity for this red-green alliance, as I speak about it, to bring their politics into the school systems and to our children's lives. And with it comes this real socialist agenda. And many of the concepts are ones that I have learned through my translators of the Cultural Revolution in China and how it was expressed in that nation. Moms and dads who survived the Cultural Revolution that I have as my friends here in Northern Virginia, who told me the stories of what socialism meant in their lives and what it meant, if, as many people know from history, is a war on intellectuals, on learning, on meritocracy. And that is what started happening in the summer of 2020, where the ideas of socialism started entering into our K through 12 system. In that summer, we were very thrilled because my son had been accepted a couple of years earlier into this school called Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology in Alexandria, Virginia. And he had been granted admission based on a merit-based test. So what had happened at the school with the immigration of many technology experts from India is that our student body population had become 70% Asian. Well, the new racial justice movement of the summer of 2020 had in its sights the idea of merit. And our school is considered the #1 high school in America based on US News and World Report's rankings. So it is the crown jewel of America's school system. And they had TJ in its crosshairs. And so when I talk about a character assassination campaign, it happens not only against individuals, but institutions. And what I witnessed then was an attack on this school. The school with a majority minority population was suddenly called segregated. And our Asian students and families were called white adjacent. We were even smeared as white supremacists. And who did it, Irina? This is what blew me out of the water. I understood if it was just the socialist, leftist agenda, trying to get rid of merit. But what happened is the education secretary of Virginia came out of the Islamist movement, funded right here in Northern Virginia at 500 Grove Street. He was a man by the name of Atif Karni, a Pakistani American Muslim, and a former middle school teacher who got elevated to be Virginia Education Secretary. How? Through political contributions and the influence of the Muslim Brothers in Northern Virginia and the United States through movements like Justice Democrats and the Democratic Party. So Atif Karni put his sights on the school and merit. And with a vote of 12-0, the all-Democratic school board removed the merit-based test. The idea of academic accomplishment has deteriorated at TJ. The advanced math classes that students filled have now become fewer. And Irina, I couldn't believe it. But there we saw that marriage, of the socialists who I've now understood as a movement called Red for Ed with the Islamists. Where is the hand of Russia and China in all of this? I don't yet know, but you can sure bet that I'm going to figure it out. I
And they
will
certainly benefit from these developments, because having fewer advanced students in STEM certainly puts us at a disadvantage against China. And while Russia is weak on many levels, they certainly are happy whenever US is weakened in any way, even if they themselves cannot be directly, competitive.
Yes. And that is exactly what's happening. So they defeated merit at Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. And now what we have witnessed in the almost 3 years since is a war on merit across the nation. Exactly, just like you said so well just now, the dumbing down of America is a victory then for our enemies, right? And what has happened is students in Culver City, California, outside of LA, cannot take English honors classes anymore. The admission in Philadelphia to the advanced academics schools has now become lottery-based. Just today, I reported about how a college preparation class in our home school district here, Fairfax County, Virginia, is targeted toward Black and Hispanic students, whom we must, of course, uplift, and it excludes Asian students. So it is a targeted effort to try to bring the top down. And that's where my friends who are Chinese American, embracing the United States of America and rejecting the communism and socialism of their home countries, they have educated me, because it's their children now who are also in the crosshairs of this movement. It is an effort to try to take opportunity away, and the concept of equal opportunity, which this country was built on, that my father came to this country to embrace. And that is why, the subtitle to the book is about this alliance that is working to undermine America's freedom, because the freedom to have equal opportunity and merit is such a precious one. You know, it is the one that allowed me to go from being this girl who knew not a word of English to becoming a Wall Street Journal reporter at the age of 23, investigating money and politics in the United States of America. It's what gives us all opportunity and hope. And so that is, to me, the most insidious and diabolical part of this campaign, because I see young people losing hope now. And we can see it in the brain health statistics that we're seeing about the younger generation. If they don't feel like there's an equal opportunity, which many of them are now starting to feel, then they lose hope. And when you lose hope, you've lost your entire sense of being and purpose in this world. And so to me, you know, this is a fight of human rights and civil rights, because this is about fighting for the humanity of all people. When you take this hierarchy of human value and start crushing certain people, killing them even, as they did to my friend Danny, then you're on the wrong side of history. And that's why, like, we should be so clear. I always say that we are on the correct side of history.
You know, it's very obvious to me from everything you told me that that this alliance operates on two fronts. On the policy front, erasing the sort of opportunities that make our society worth defending, and creating a hopeless society where young men, most of whom go into STEM, not to stereotype, but that's where you know, disproportionately they would go now, don't have opportunities. So we ask ourselves, how come more young men don't go to college? Well, what's there to go for if they're not going to get anywhere anyway? And at the same time, they try to stop anyone who gets in the way of exposing it, even closer, from any range of tactics, from character assassination to outright murder. And quite frankly, these two start to merge. We've seen attempts by the Iranian regime to assassinate or abduct people from here, from our territory. How soon till these political Islamists from the Muslim Brotherhood variety do the same? How soon you don't have to travel to Pakistan to be abducted and killed? How soon till it starts happening on our soil?
Yes, just like you said, the regime in Iran sent kidnappers to take the body of Masih Alinejad, you know, our journalist in the United States, from her home in Brooklyn, and flee, you know, through this complicated web of boats and planes. And they figured it out, and they came to the soil to do it. I'm so grateful that it's the law that now is convicted those men that were involved in that case. And I do believe, Irina, that we have to use law everywhere we can. It is ultimately on our side. I know it is. So what happened is that they tried to use, you know, their social justice activism to really, I'm not exaggerating this, but like kidnap our kids, you know, like I'm saying this rhetorically, but I'm just using your question to make a point that I think is one that I have felt deep in my heart, that they're abducting children's minds and bodies now, in some cases, through these more complicated, you know, campaigns on gender and sexuality, to steal children. And there's a new book by some friends of mine, one of them who is an immigrant from Russia, and it's called Stolen Youth. And this is what is happening to children today, both in futures that are stolen because you dumb the kids down, you do not teach them to the highest levels that they can reach. And I don't want to, you know, give too much credence to the social justice warriors that I was once proud to be among until they kind of lost their way. But there's one, she calls herself, an anti-racist warrior, and Bettina Love is her name. And she talks about spirit murdering in school systems, to talk about systemic injustice that has been used to crush the spirits of Black children, which we cannot deny. Of course, it existed during these awful periods of segregation and lost opportunities. I'm so glad about the progress that we've made. But now, what's the irony and ultimately the moral bankruptcy of the new social justice movement is that it is justifying the spirit murdering of children that are in the bottom rungs of their new hierarchy of human value. It's so despicable to me, because what they are doing from the lens of, socialism and collectivism is they are also taking away and stealing the rights of parents to parent. They are changing laws and policies so that a child at 13 can now have their own email address, to have a private conversation with their physician, to engage in gender transition surgeries and hormone replacement therapies, all a secret from their parents. And it is so diabolical. So I think there's an opportunity there for a split with the Muslims that have become part of this alliance, because I don't know any Muslim parent that's going to say, yeah, I want the state to make a decision about my 13-year-old daughter and her gender and sexuality. So we're seeing parents in Dearborn, Michigan and Minneapolis stand up and break from this alliance.
Mhm.
But really, the question that you had about the kidnapping of people is a real one, both metaphorically and in practical literally, because the more these people think that they can get away with it, which is what they are being told in American society today, the more they're going to try to get away with, and that's why every single person, that's why I say to, sometimes people DM me on Twitter and they have 9 followers, or I DM them and I just say, thank you for having my back, just for speaking up, because if you have 9,000 followers or 9 followers, sometimes you're even more powerful with 9 followers, because you are just that ordinary person who is speaking truth to tyranny, and you're so valuable. And I know every time you post a comment, when I'm getting harassed or they're trying to slay me, I see your comments and I feel them in my heart, because I know then for sure I'm not alone and somebody's watching. That's the biggest thing. It's like that kind of kidnapping, that kind of crime and assault on people. It particularly, like, sure, it's happening in the light of day still, increasingly, but people need to know that folks are watching and that they're protectors, of those that are taking the slings and the arrows.
Daylight is the best medicine, but for
Yeah.
sure, unless this is this corruption if it continues to spread from defamatory tactics and speech that is used to kill character, that it can easily go into physical violence and efforts to kill off the people who propagate ideas as much as the ideas themselves. And that's what you have to be wary about. And that's why every American, even if they're not interested in geopolitics, should be reading a book, should be listening to this conversation, and should be aware how what starts with something specific in a faraway world 20 years ago, it can progress to the point that we are seeing our entire society transformed today.
Yeah, and I want to show folks, I'm going to just share a few illustrations. I'm going to break the fourth wall, as Deadpool likes to say in the graphic novel. I want to show you guys just a few examples that how you're not exaggerating about this assault on identity also. So these are just a few examples, just a few that I plucked from, again, chronologically, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the Islamic extremism of 9/11, and then wokeism. Wokeism is here. And what do we have beginning the racial shield that the Muslims have used to? Critical race theory, born in the 1980s and then 1990s by folks like Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the architect of this concept of intersectionality that has been weaponized. And you know, it has emerged with books like this one, Woke Baby, that is an illustration of that they're going after kids, you know, this nice little cardboard book for big fingers. Then they're going after issues of gender and sexuality. This has literal porn in its pages for young middle school kids, even getting kids to question, you know, the identity that they were born into. Gay BCs, which is bringing in, you know, ideas of sophisticated nuance to little 4-year-old hands now. T is not for train anymore, but T is for, you can see it here, trans. And, you know, as a Muslim reformer, I have always been supportive of the LGBTQ community in challenging those interpretations of Islamism and extremist Islam that want to throw them off rooftops, right? Like, I have faced death threats myself for standing up for the right of adults to make adult decisions. But as a mother, and even as a classic liberal, I know that there's lines that we have to draw about what's appropriate for children. But in this book, I think, Irina, this really captures, you know, the question about how socialism, Marxism, militancy ends up a part of this dynamic. Because A is for activist, and I know I fancy myself an activist also, been proud of that. But all you have to do is go to Z, and you can see the image then is Z is now for Zapatista, which, if people don't know it, is, you know, Marxist socialist movement of militancy in Mexico. And what is the image but a masked man, you know, as if that is now the heroic image that we want our little children to embrace. And that helps me as a parent understand really clearly how nefarious the intentions are of this movement. And I hope that there will be schisms within it as people and parents especially realize that they don't want to just surrender their kid to the state and to these, not even the state, but these activist agendas. That's what the survivors of the Cultural Revolution lived through. You know, they lived through their childhoods hijacked by the state and by the movement of Marxism, communism, socialism, whatever you want to call it. And so I hope everybody realizes that everything that we've talked about is, you know, really coming for kids, you know, ultimately, because they are so vulnerable. And we know this, like, we know this from the history of time. I knew it in my work against Islamic extremism. They had to put the extremist ideology into these schools that they call madrasas, you know, where the most vulnerable children were then indoctrinated into an extremist interpretation of faith. convinced to put on suicide vests and shamed through sexual humiliation, even to do the bidding of these ideologues. And so I just hope everybody will be, really protective of the society in which we live, the freedoms that we enjoy, and then the children that we brought into this world, so that they, in their own personal individual lives, can be the best of who they can be, and then also grow up into a nation that is the best of what we can be. That's really such high stakes game that we're in, I think.
Well, thank you so much for the important work you're doing, for your courage, for your commitment, and for being an example for how everyone can embrace their talents and put them towards really the betterment of humanity, really helping making the world a better place through journalism, through activism, through investigation and research and analysis, and by standing up to evil when you see it. Because it's not always, people keep saying that evil is not easy to define, but frankly sometimes you know it when you see it.
Yes, it's so true. And thank you for being such a strong advocate out there for the truth telling and piercing through falsehood. You've been a real inspiration to me, and really taking so much that we see in front of our faces and then translating it, as you've done so well in our conversation. I listened to, your reflection back to me of what you've heard from me, and I think, oh, she understood it so well and captured it so effectively. So that's a talent to Irina. You have also been such a model for how to take our own personal experiences and keep persevering for the greater good. So you captured really well what I hope that we leave with everybody that's watching. And I definitely hope that everybody will also get this lesson to, tap your heart, take what it is that you think about when you rest your head on your bed at night, and turn that reflection, that meditation, that observation into a work that can process it for other people, so take your own suffering and translate it into lessons for everybody, because that's the best what we can do with whatever our life script may become. And thank you, Irina, for being on this journey with me. Also, I am so happy that I'm able to share the book and its results with you, but not only that, but just, the experience. So thank you.
Thank you so much for everyone watching us. Please make sure to get the book Walk Army by Asra and Nomani and read it. I'm sure it'll be both exhilarating and horrifying, but very necessary. And thank you so much for joining us today. This was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio, and with you was Irina Zuckerman, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Please come back next week, same time as always, Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Looking forward to our next discussion, and thank you for joining.